Hey, everybody. So, as we keep talking about the emotionally healthy leader, I want to talk about the other two sections here. We just talked about self assessment and emotionally unhealthy, asking the question. But I want to look briefly at the next two sections, the inner life and the outer life, and just some highlights from those. I'm not going to read the book to you necessarily, but just want to take it in and excuse me. Also talk about just some points from it I think that are really good. You know, there was an article in the New York Times about, this is interesting, 10 years ago, long before we had to get into this digital world that we're in now, where we're even doing this. And a person wrote about the struggle of what the digital universe was doing. And there was a book that was written called Alone Together by Sherry Turkle, an MIT professor. And one of the things that she wrote about was how on Twitter, Facebook, you're trying to express something real about who you are. But because you are also creating something for others' consumption, you find yourself imagining and playing to your audience more and more. So those moments in which you're supposed to be showing your true self become a performance. Your psychology becomes a performance. And I think this is fascinating. Because it said, referring to the lonely crowd, I think it's interesting. It says, the landmark description of the transformation of the American character from being inner to outer directed. Now, here's what I find fascinating about that is now we're really forced to say, what do we need? To connect with each other the only way we can through these kind of mediums. We're in a parking lot 6-10 feet apart, whatever. That we're having to be forced, instead of looking at outer directedness, we're having to use technology to say, how do we meet the inner world? And I think that's amazing, especially in light of this article. Having to be more, what is to first look inward, as Peter Scazzaro does in his book, The Inner Life. What is the real you? This is what he gets to first. One of the things he talks about is modeling the being real. And I think that the position of leadership in any other place is for us to model what it means to be real. I think often we still do it, especially in the South, that being a real person is still rare. We still highlight and look at people up front. I think authenticity is really important and people value it, but we still kind of have this distance. I was just talking to somebody about it just the other day, about that there still feels like this distance of people who are in a position of high leadership. There's not a real connection. They don't feel like real people often. And if there's anything that we can do to show the gospel is real, it's showing the incarnation is real. That Jesus, as the highest leader he could be, puts himself in a position to be the most real and known, touchable, connectable. And what does it mean to be real? What does it mean for you to have authenticity and having healthy authenticity in a position of leadership so that people know that the gospel is real? So when we translate any other news that the gospel is, other than it being good news, that you don't have to be a fake person. You don't have to be somebody who is putting on a show or has to be perfect. And we say these things, but are we really living it? Is the way we're living it displaying the real, authentic us? And it's really important. And it doesn't mean we need to be traveling confessional booths. I think that to the other extreme that's gotten too, where we're like so real that we want everybody to know us in a certain way. That's not healthy either. Then we'd have no boundaries. Just as the Proverbs talk about, a water is supposed to have certain boundaries. If it's too constricted, right, then you feel like there's not much there. It's stiff. The water flow is. But if there's no pipes, no constriction over the water, then the water goes everywhere. And you've met, and maybe some of you have encountered that as well, where you feel like it's a flood of someone's emotions or reality on you. There's a healthy way of us understanding. There are people we can flood with, and they can sit with us in the flood, but not everybody. And there are people who, where we don't need to be constricted with And sometimes we need to be, maybe more, for our own emotional safety. But the real you is modeling what it means to have healthy boundaries, right? Healthy authenticity. So that's one of the things I find is really important from his connection there about the inner life. I think another one is the expectations. And he talks about this in the one about ministry in your, wherever you are in life, whether it be marriage or singleness. I think what he's getting with that I really like, and he talks about the expectation, limits, and wisdom. The expectations of knowing where you're called. I remember teaching an RUF campus ministry group on this one time, the campus ministers. And my job was to teach them on dynamics of ministry in family life. And some of these people were married, some not, some had kids, some not. The point was that I brought up to them is, are we hiding from the Lord in either place? Is the expectation to be called to the church more than the expectation of being called in our family? And are we hiding from either place? Well, maybe just as we would in any other job. Are we looking at ministry to provide for us something that feels good about us? Maybe something's difficult at home, and instead we're looking to ministry to provide something to feel good about ourselves, or vice versa. And we need to be aware of that. The inner life, limits, knowing ourselves, knowing our King, and wisdom of making those choices, and really knowing that those things go together. They're linked. So I think the inner life really is connected between, and that's the odd thing about ministry leadership, is that sometimes the lines are a lot more blurry than they are in any other vocation. And so because of that, we have to learn how to set those limits, set boundaries that I think are very important. I'm going to get to that a little more in the outer life. But inner life, I think that's important. And, you probably know as well as I do, when I know internally when I've allowed my own boundaries to be crossed, I get resentful. And you probably do too. And when that happens, that's a good indicator to listen to and say, why did I allow myself to cross that boundary? Whether it would be with my family, my ministry, my time, my resources, whatever it is. And we need to see that. Just something else to highlight in the inner life that I thought was really helpful was slowing down for loving union and practice Sabbath delight. Resting. As a pastor, look, I work on Sundays. My question constantly is, how am I resting during the week? Because I am working in a sense on Sundays, right? I am worshiping, but I am working. And some of you are going to experience this in a profound way when you jump into the ministry leadership of the confusion of slowing down and resting and still practicing Sabbath, and actually helping others to practice it too, including myself. And so slowing down for loving union means not just showing up feeling like Sunday is work day, but also connecting to the Lord. Not just on Sunday, but the rest of the week. Slowing down for loving union, meaning union with your Lord Jesus. That you don't see it as I'm coming and I'm seeing, okay, how's the money being counted? How are the people coming in? How are these things? But that your leadership position means even more so, you're paying attention to your loving union with the Lord first, then going into the rest of your week as a leader and working in and through the church. Practicing the Sabbath, practicing church, explaining that by your actions to everyone around you so that they can understand that too. That's really valuable because people look to us as leaders in the church to model that rest. They see us exhausted. They hear us talk about how we're working so much. That's not a humble brag. We can't do that. We need to be honest and practice Sabbath delight and brag on our rest too, because it's okay to do that as well. Well, inner life, that's our inner life. I want to talk briefly about our outer life. And I think the one I really want to harp on the most is the power and wise boundaries. Because I think some of the other ones we could discuss, but the one I really find that's important is talking about our limits. And loving our limits and grieving our limits. And this connects to our inner life. And so I think the thing with leadership is that we find that people are to look to us, and we may look to ourselves to exceed limitation. This is the number one thing I saw in the scriptures with the Pharisees. When the Pharisees are arguing with Jesus, they are constantly arguing with him in different passages about the law, right? And when they do, it's not necessarily that they think Jesus is breaking it. It's that they actually think they're keeping it. They want to keep the law instead of grieving the losses where they can't and going before the Lord, humble. They're talking about how they keep the law so they can stay above it, so that they can control it. And instead of embracing their limitations of not being able to keep it, that's where Jesus points them out, right? Knowing and loving their limits. They don't know their limits and they don't love them. And so the law becomes their relationship rather than the Lord. See, when the Lord is our relationship rather than the law, we love our limits and we grieve our losses. And there are losses in this where you need to grieve. When it comes to this, when you're taking this up, this leadership position, it's going to be one that forces you to grieve cost. There are costs. There's grieving loss in certain ways. And it's going to be really powerful for you to make sense of your boundaries, be wise about them, your limits, and grieve them. There's certain things you have to give up instead. Certain things it's going to cost to step in a leadership position and see things that are harder that you never saw before. And being willing to see them and grieve the limitations of even being able to heal or do anything about them. Certain people who are hurt, certain people who are needy and needing something. It's really difficult sometimes to see and not be able to do something for other than just be with. And so grieving and loving our limits is really powerful and important. I think things that he says in his book about this is grieving limits of your physical body, grieving limits of your family origin and things you see come out in the sin patterns of your life, the weavings, particular weavings you have in your life. Grieving both your marital status or lack thereof. What's your marriage like? Grieving the limitations of it and those kind of things. Grieving intellectual capacity. Maybe there are others, and this is going to be one of those things, about you come into a leadership position in a room full of other leaders and ask yourself, where do I fall in here? One of the ways we need to grieve our limits and love our limits is seeing how there are people that are way better leaders than we are in certain things and being okay with it, spiritually as well. Not just at doing ministry, but maybe we see someone's relationship with the Lord and we envy it because we ourselves are struggling with our gifting rather than the graces, right? Going back to that. Grieving our talents, gifts, material wealth, our time, grieving the limitations on our time. He says, grieving our work relationship realities, things that we can't finish. The ministry, I'll tell you, I went around one time at a meeting, and one of the things that was discussed was, what are the things that are difficult about your job? And everybody went around and they skipped me because I was a pastor. I was the only one in the room pastor. I said, whoa, let me stop. Can I go? And I said, they go, sure. And I said, one of the hardest things for me in ministry leadership is not seeing a lot of things completed. And a lot of things aren't. And there's a lot of tension of seeing some things resolved, but not a lot. Because there are a lot of things that are ongoing until the Lord Jesus returns. And it can be hard. And it's being limited in that. So these are just ways I think are really good. I'd love for you to interact and think about your limitations, the things, the boundaries you struggle with. Think about both outwardly and then inwardly, going back to the inward life, what we just talked about and discussed in terms of what you see about the real you, the authenticity that you hold. And then we're going to come back in a little bit, take a break, think on these things, write about them. We're going to come back in a bit and talk about the 4 corners of relationship.